Welcome to another episode of the Kubik Report. With me again is Kurt Hoyer, whom we have spoken to before in June of this year. Today is the last day of 2024, so we are squeezing in 2 podcasts from Kurt in just 1 year. So welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
Thank you very much, Vic. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Well, we have found you to be a very enjoyable guest with a lot of information and a very colorful life that you presented to us. You gave us quite a description of your career and life in the first podcast, and I'm including a quick link in the show notes to that podcast. I actually went back and listened to it again from June of this past year and found it to be just fascinating. Kurt has had a very illustrious career in the Foreign Service for more than 20 years and has lived in various places around the world. In fact, our paths crossed in Manila, Philippines, 1 year. His passion and interest has always been in archaeology. He has a degree from Hebrew University in archaeology and the Near East. So, this includes most everything from the Old Testament and combines his involvement with the Church of God and his special interest. Kurt and I discussed what types of subjects might be of interest to you and settled in on, among probably half a dozen or so, the top 5 archaeological discoveries relating to the Bible in the year 2024. So, Kurt, tell us about it.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, and as you know, and as many of the listeners know, almost everybody does a top 10 this of 2024, a top X of what year. So there actually are several top 10 lists of archaeological discoveries related to the Bible out there. But I figured 10 was a bit too many because you can't go into much detail. I've watched a few of them and they barely mention what they are. And so I thought I would compact it and combine some of the information for this list, make it a little bit shorter so we go a bit more in depth as to why it's important and some of the details about it. And also I need to note that not all of these were discovered actually in 2024. Many of them were discovered a few years ago, but are just being published for the first time or are being put on display for the first time in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you mentioned that, and but still, they're kind of hot right now, and they could be They could be cataloged. Obviously, they didn't discover all these things, but let's get right to them because I'm sure that we'll have a hard time squeezing all of them in. The first one that you mentioned was a shipwreck 50 miles off the coast of Israel. And you might also mention one thing before we go further. You mentioned certain periods of time like Bronze Age or the New Bronze Age. You may want to just give our listeners a little bit of knowledge about these ages, because people sometimes when they think about the Iron Age or the Bronze Age, they think of cavemen, when they think of prehistoric times, and then realize that they were very much in the life and history of people that we have historical records of. So let's just start with your first discovery.
Okay. Yes, as you mentioned, a shipwreck about 50 miles off the coast of Israel. It was discovered in 2023 when somebody was out doing some survey work of the ocean floor in preparation for oil and gas exploration. As many people may have known, there recently have been a number of very large natural gas discoveries off the coast of Israel. And so they were trying to continue that work. And lo and behold, they found about a mile under the surface of the ocean a shipwreck, which, based upon the shape of the storage jars it was containing, dates somewhere between 1500 to 1500 to 1200 BC. Mm-hmm. Now that's the period we call the Late Bronze Age. So if I can just sort of segue from there, just briefly, the history that we're dealing with is divided primarily into 2 periods: the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The Bronze Age is earlier. The Iron Age is much closer to our time. The primary technology in the Bronze Age was bronze, for example. And in the Iron Age, iron generally starts to replace bronze. It's not to say they were exclusively used in those periods, but those are sort of the main technological artifacts from those periods. The Bronze Age, we're going to talk about the Late Bronze Age. As I said, 1500 BC goes to about 1200 BC. So if you want to connect that with a known figure, that's sometime just before the Exodus, let's say.
Hmm.
until sometime after the arrival, about 200 years after the arrival in Canaan of the Israelites.
This is very important information just to get our mile markers or to get our timestamp,
Right,
other things that are
right,
talked about. Yeah. Please
right.
go ahead.
So yeah, we're talking about sometime before Moses, sometime and then during that period of the Exodus, the conquest, the occupation of Canaan by the Israelites, but before it becomes a kingdom. So we're talking into the period of the Judges, and then there's a change from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age about the same time that the period of the judges is starting to draw to a close, and Israel is moving on towards wanting its own king. So if you want a biblical time frame for these references, that's the time frame we're talking about.
Hmm.
So why is a shipwreck in the middle of the ocean important? Well, previously shipwrecks have been found in many other places in the Mediterranean, around Greece, around Turkey, and even up into the Black Sea. But most of these ships have been found close to the shore, and as in right off the shore, 30, 40, 50 feet of water, maybe 100 feet of water. So that's fairly easy to recover artifacts from, fairly easy to do the archaeological. Well, I say fairly easy, but nobody wants to be diving at 100 feet. Let's let's admit that right up. So the idea has always been that in the late Bronze Age, which we know was an era of great commerce, great trade, and we know that from some of these shipwrecks. Actually, we we always considered that these voyages were primarily done fairly close to shore. We see that even in the voyage of Paul when he's doing his missionary voyages. His ship routes pulls into one port one day, then sails along, pulls into another port. So they're staying pretty close to the shore.
Hmm.
This one, however, is 50 miles off the coast of Israel, 56 miles off the coast of Israel. That's basically out of sight of land.
Hmm.
So depending on what we can pull up from the wreck, which will help indicate how it sunk and why it sank, this could be a shipwreck on a regular trade route, which
Hmm.
would indicate that the ancient mariners were much more sophisticated than we have evidence for. Now, we've always thought that it's always been an open possibility that this is possible, but we like to look for absolute proof. And this again could possibly be some of that proof, depending again on how and why it sank. If it was blown off course and sank, then the question still remains a bit open because the storms can blow a ship pretty far.
Hmm.
But it does seem to indicate a higher level of sophistication in seafaring ability and a higher level of courage among the crews and all the people involved. Interesting as well with this shipwreck, if it dates to 1500 BC, it will be the oldest shipwreck ever found in the Mediterranean.
Oh, okay.
It's also at a mile deep. It's already the deepest shipwreck ever found so far, and it seems to have settled vertically, intact. So it didn't tip over and all the contents spill out for a couple miles along the ocean floor. It all seems to be fairly intact. And if they can get the right kind of robots down there to look at it, then that may be able to help them determine why it sank.
Well, that would be great to find out what's in that ship. What types of artifacts, bulls, designs that for a certain period, and match that up with the migrations of people around the Mediterranean, and to see if we got to match them up because there's all kinds of stories about people migrating from the Middle East, to where that Britain is today, and Northwest Europe. Be nice to match up some evidence of communication between those peoples.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And so far they have uncovered, I think, two or three fairly standard Canaanite storage and shipping jars from the time period. What they may have had in them, I have not. I don't think they've actually done any analysis yet. Sometimes you can't if they've been down at the bottom of the ocean for that long. It can be hard to find residues and things like that. But
Hmm.
yes, certainly this opens up even wider the possibilities of the trade routes and the communication links that we already know exist. For example, the one of the shipwrecks off the coast of Turkey, which dates to the end of the 14th century, so sometime around, let's say 1300 BC, because that's the end of the 14th century. So a bit younger than this one probably is. It sank with about 10 tons of copper on it. as well as goods from Egypt, from Syria, from Phoenicia, probably goods from Israel or Canaan, as the land was called at that time. And interestingly enough, that included things like jewelry. Had, like I said, copper. It had rare woods on it. It had glass ingots,
Mm-hmm.
and it also had tin ingots. And you need tin to mix with copper to make bronze.
Mm-hmm.
There were 10 tons of copper. There was 1 ton of tin, and that's just the perfect blending ratio for good quality bronze. When they tested the tin, however, they found something I thought was fascinating, and that was that some of the tin came from Tajikistan, which is 1,300 miles away from the Mediterranean coast. So we already know that these commerce and trading networks spread far and wide just from that one wreck alone.
Well, that is very, very fascinating. I've been close to Tajikistan. I've been to Uzbekistan, and
Okay,
actually,
yeah,
well, yeah, yeah. Well, and actually, very surprised. This was later in period, though. There are people from the Babylonian captivity that were resettled into that area. Of course, this is much, much later. After
right,
Nebuchadnezzar's siege. But it was interesting to
right,
find the migrations of people and keeping their cultures and their synagogue and everything else in Uzbekistan that dated
right,
back to that
right.
time. But
Yeah.
anyway, this is just very, very fascinating. Well, can we maybe move on to the second of the discoveries, which
Sure. Do we need to do a drum roll between each of these,
I
or
think we
just for the
could do a
last one?
drum roll, but maybe I can edit that in.
4.
Number 4, alphabetic writing in Syria. Okay, tell us about it.
Okay. Yeah, this was a very interesting find, because it if it turns out to be verifiable, it blows a big hole in the history of writing in a good way. In a good way. So, in Syria, about 3 or 4 years ago, I believe, a tomb was excavated, that was dated to about 2,300 BC. And among the grave goods, they found some clay beads that looked like they'd hung around a necklace around the person's neck in the tomb. And so, they were made by hand, and they were, a few inches, half an inch long, inch and a half long, I should say, round clay beads, or tubular clay beads, nothing super impressive. But they found markings on them. And the archaeologists at the time said, this looks like writing. And not only does it look like writing, it looks like some of the symbols are very similar to what we call Proto-Sinaitic, which is the earliest alphabet we have today,
Mm-hmm.
and is the father of the alphabets of Aramaic and Hebrew and Canaanite and all those sorts of things. At least that is the prevailing thought. It's called Proto-Sinaitic because it was first discovered in the Sinai Peninsula. The thing is, Proto-Sinaitic dates to about 1800 BC. So that would put these writings 500 years earlier. So if it does turn out to be these things do turn out to be alphabetic symbols, then this pushes the birth of an alphabetic writing system back 500 years, which is an amazing shift in
Mm-hmm.
what we know. That then opens up, okay, well, then where did the alphabet come from? If the Sinaitic dating is correct, that's 1800. Did the alphabet maybe start in Syria? Or because they look similar in some cases, well, then is this a result of trade? Maybe it started earlier in Sinai, but this is the first evidence we have all the way up in Syria because they had contact with each other, or maybe it started in Syria and this people in Sinai, adopted it. I mean, who knows where this will lead? At the moment, the language that it is writing is unknown. It probably will remain unknown because they only found about 8 symbols, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not talking about like a written document here. We're talking, like I said, some clay beads, tubular beads with some letters scratched on.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need about 20 to 26 letters to really make an alphabet. And of course, the advantage of an alphabet, as you mentioned, is that now you can break each word down into various sounds, and you don't have to memorize how to write the symbol for each word. Chinese has thousands of characters. Ancient cuneiform and hieroglyphics had thousands of characters because you had words, you had syllables, you had sort of a pseudo alphabet, you had all kinds of things, and you had to memorize all those. So an alphabet makes writing much easier. It makes it easier to teach. It makes it easier for people to learn. It expands the ability of a society to be literate. So if you have an alphabetic writing system that dates back that far, then you also have the possibility of a more literate society that dates back that far.
And be able to pass it on to another generation that could build from that.
And it doesn't just have to be the scribes and the priests and secret hidden knowledge. This is something that is used in a much more mundane manner, usually. In addition to those other things, we write literature with ours. We also do our taxes, et cetera, et cetera.
Now let's go drum roll here to the third find, Megiddo, the Megiddo Mosaic. Tell us about it.
Megiddo Mosaic. Now, we're going to jump forward to the New Testament period, actually, even after the New Testament was written. This was a find that was discovered while the Israelis were expanding a prison in the area of Megiddo. It was found in 2005, but it's being exhibited right now at the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. So if anyone is in that area or can get to that area, I highly recommend going to see it. It's an very interesting display. And what it is, it's the mosaic floor of a church. As many people may know, a mosaic is a design pressed into a floor made up of tiny little squares of stone and pottery and glass and sometimes gemstones and things like that. And it's used like a carpet as a decorative issue. Obviously, a carpet you can't move, but it's pressed into the floor. And this one comes from a church building that was used by Christian worshipers. And it was probably part of either a large private farmhouse or some sort of small industrial facility from the Roman period. And it dates to about 230 AD. So it is the oldest Christian house of worship that was specifically built for that purpose that has been found so far. And it was probably, like I said, a chapel or a house of prayer that was attached to a large residence, although there was probably some public access to it as well. This was not just a personal chapel of whoever lived in the building. And we know it's Christian because the mosaic lists a bunch of names of people who were involved in building it. And it also has a phrase that dedicates it to the God Jesus Christ. So this building is dedicated to the God Jesus Christ. And that is the earliest reference we've ever found to outside the Bible to Jesus being referred to as God.
And that's about 230 AD. 230
AD, yes.
I know that
people have argued about that for years. When did that first begin? And now we've got a date. We know it happened before 230 AD because it's written in a floor at that time. So
I have traveled to the Soviet Union on their 50th anniversary. Now, that's a long time ago, 1967, the 50th anniversary of the Communist Party. But we had traveled into areas adjacent to it, to Armenia, to Georgia, and had come across old churches, but old then, the ones that were to us were like 600 to 800 AD. So this is very interesting, 230. And we did find the style of the mosaics. It was a very durable style. It would last forever. And and it was a way to depict some event in history, whatever, artistically, and also, be durable and last till now. So this is very interesting that we can go back now to 230 AD. This is just a couple centuries after Christ was here on the earth. Right.
Just a couple centuries, and it's also interesting in the fact of what was chosen for decoration. In many mosaics we see later, you've got the saints depicted, you've got Jesus Christ depicted, or whatever. This one is primarily geometric designs. So like I said, it looks kind of like a carpet. It has a border around it. It's geometric designs. It's got some other geometric designs in part of it. It is off center for the room, which means there was probably something else in the room on top of it. And I think there was probably a table on top of it. because you don't make a mosaic and there's a blank space in the mosaic basically, and that's probably where the table was sitting, because you don't put your designs on something and then cover them up so they can't be seen.
Yeah, unless you're having guests over for dinner. On your table.
Yes. The other decorative motifs are there's a round part of the decoration that has a couple bread loaves and fish in it, which is obviously a reference to the loaves and fishes that Jesus used when he was feeding the 5,000. And then there are 6 names mentioned in this mosaic, which is not necessarily rare, but to have that many in a relatively small space is kind of rare. The 6 names, one of them is a Roman centurion who donated money to have the church built. Now, this was at a time when doing something like that could bring the death penalty, because there was a very anti-Christian atmosphere in the Roman Empire at this time. But you still have someone who's identified as a Roman centurion who is willing to at least go partially public with the fact that he's donating money to a church. Another name was the man who made the mosaic. He got to sign it, which is kind of neat. And then the other 4 are all women, and they were all part of the group or whomever who were dedicating that building to their faith and to, as they say, the God Jesus Christ. So it's a very interesting combination of names, and you can speculate endlessly about why they are that way. But we know Paul had women who were helping him. Jesus had female followers as well, so it shouldn't come as a surprise.
We also had the Roman centurion story in Acts 10 and 11.
Right.
That went public too. He may have been retired, but nonetheless, we have the centurion that kind of mixed with the local faith. Well, that's fascinating. What about the pictures? Were they kind of like icons, or they were just artistic work, and were there halos around their head? I mean, what types of stuff?
There were no people pictured, which is interesting. It was just a couple fish and a couple. It's hard to make a loaf of bread out of mosaics, but a couple loaves of bread. And they were. It's not an extremely detailed mosaic like some I've seen where it looks like the animals are about to come alive and jump off and eat you. It's a bit more plain than that, but it's definitely loaves and fishes sitting on a plate, and that's the only sort of living things that were depicted. Everything else is geometric designs.
Well, the only connection I have with loaves and fishes are in Galilee on a trip to Israel, the Loaves and Fishes restaurant up there.
Yes. Loaves and Fishes restaurant, and you can always eat St. Peter's fish and all the good stuff over there.
Well, this is the original of that. Okay, anything more about the Megiddo Mosaic?
The woman who one of the mosaic references is about the woman who dedicated a table to the church. So there's probably some sort of ritual function of that table. Maybe they were putting loaves and fish on the table, or bread and wine on the table for a ceremony. But it's interesting. What was interesting to me was she's also referred to as a God lover, which is not too far away from the phrase in the New Testament, God-fearers.
God-fearers.
Which was a phrase used by Jews about Greeks who were in the process of conversion. Now, she does not have a Hebrew name, so she's probably not in the process of conversion to Judaism, etc. But it was interesting that you've got a similarity in language there that we find in the New Testament itself.
People will find, too, that different languages pass on God-fearer, God-lover. I know there's a similar word in the Ukrainian and Russian language that doesn't quite come across in the English language, but nonetheless it conveys some of the deep passion and respect for God. So that's very interesting. Okay, so we're down to 2 more. The Lachish Comb. What is the Lachish Comb? This one is here, very, very mysterious.
Yeah, this is a really fun one. The Lachish Comb is a small ivory comb that was found in an excavation at the city of Lachish. Now, Lachish was, at the time of the Babylonian conquest, for example, Lachish was probably the 2nd largest city in Judah. So it is in the foothills. I think it's about 20 miles out southwest of Jerusalem. So it's one of the strong points that guarded the valleys leading up to Jerusalem. It has been an important city for the Kingdom of Judah for many years. When I say small, I mean it's about 1.5 inches long by 1 inch tall. It's
Yeah.
very small. It was found in a dump, so it's hard to. The context could not give us a dating on it, but we'll see the dating of it in just a minute through another means. It's made out of ivory, and that ivory has been determined to be elephant tusk ivory.
Mm-hmm.
So it is obviously an imported item. So this is a comb. It's imported. It's made out of a rather expensive material. So this is an object that a wealthy person would have used. It has very small teeth on it, or what's left of the teeth are very thin. It's toothed on both sides. And what you would do is you would hold it and you would comb it through your hair or your beard to take the lice out of your hair or beard.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually did find the remains of lice bodies stuck between some of the teeth.
Oh, how about that?
On
Mm-hmm.
this comb.
Mm-hmm.
So, so they could identify the species of louse and all that sort of thing. It was the native species of louse and everything. This was found all the way back in 2016, and it was a nice find. They thought it was great. And then several years later, while it was still in the laboratory getting processed and preserved, somebody happened to hold it at a different angle, and she noticed that there was writing on the comb. And of course, this is exciting because, it sat there for a couple of years and everyone was kind of embarrassed that they didn't find the writing in the first place. But it was very, very tiny writing. It was very thinly etched, scratched into the comb. And it says this. It says, "May this tusk root out lice in the hair and the beard." So it's kind of a blessing.
Yeah.
Use this to give it. I keep thinking of, what would be an ancient Canaanite advertising symbol, that seems like a good one. Use this tusk to get your license out of your hair and beard.
They're sponsoring some event, probably.
Exactly. Based upon the style of the writing, first of all, it's Old Canaanite. It's an alphabetic writing.
Mm-hmm.
Based upon the style and shape of the letters, it's dated to about 1,700 BC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about 300 years before the Israelites enter Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
It's right in the period of the flourishing of Canaanite civilization, when the Canaanite city-states were very strong and powerful. It also happens to be the first complete sentence we've ever found in Canaanite. So this is really incredible.
Amazing.
Because we have a complete sentence. We can see how grammar and vocabulary works. It's a short sentence, granted,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still like a complete sentence. Usually you find, 2 or 3 words here or there.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is dated back to 1700 BC, we've got, again, alphabetic writing, which we mentioned before. This time it's a known language. We can read it. It's Canaanite. So we know that at least wealthy people in Canaan, parts of Canaan, were scratching things or having scratched for them words on everyday objects, which speaks to a pretty broad use, at least among the wealthy, of language. Yeah, so this is letting us know that the Canaanites were literate people. Again, at least the upper class. But again, this is an everyday item. The other thing that's important, or that I like about this is not an accounting tablet. This is not a religious object where they're telling you how to divine, reading goose livers or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is not a magical text that you may have bought to protect yourself. This is not a votive item. This isn't something you're giving to a god and so you scratch something on it. This is an everyday item, and I would classify the writing on it as literature,
Mm-hmm.
not accounting, not religious, not the deeds of a great king
Mm-hmm.
type of writing, not monumental. There we go. That's the
Mm-hmm.
word I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
This feels and sounds more like a very, very short piece of common literature writing,
Mm-hmm.
which also opens up all sorts of possibilities for how literate society was.
Mm-hmm.
The general consensus about how language was used is it starts off being used for accounting because you're keeping track of the sheep and the goats and whatnot, and then the priests use it, and it's kind of a secret thing, and then finally, much later, you get to literature.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is very early in the process, and we already have literature.
Mm-hmm.
So this makes us question if that sort of evolutionary development of writing really works that way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these things were all going on at the same time, and we just don't have evidence of it until now.
In the Bible, there are songs recorded that go back a long ways.
Yeah,
This is not accounting, but there's
right,
a song, something creative, something from the heart and soul,
right,
rather than
right.
just, like I said, mundane things.
Exactly. And when you look at, I mean, if you just hop over to Greece, some of the oldest writing we have from Greece are the Iliad and the Odyssey,
Mm-hmm.
which are huge pieces of literature. So each society may have done this a little bit differently. And interestingly as well, there's no mention of writing in the book of Genesis. The word isn't used. It's not until you get to the book of Exodus that the verb for writing is used,
Mm-hmm.
and it's Moses or God who's writing on the tablets with his finger, and then Moses has to rewrite it as well. Now, if we take the Exodus at 444 BC, 1444 BC, I should say, somewhere around there. This comb is 300 years, almost 250 years before that. So while it's not written in Hebrew, we do have evidence that people in that area were writing on fairly mundane things, meaning that a fair number of people understood writing 300 years before the children of Israel show up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a far stretch to say maybe they could write too, even though we don't have anything in Hebrew that dates back that far, if they even used Hebrew at that time, or if Hebrew was even distinct enough to be its own language at that time.
Well, I think the interesting thing about some of the work you're doing in archaeology is that it's giving validation to the fact that people are speculating or even observing what the Bible may have to say, and giving proof and validation to that, rather than saying it couldn't have happened. And here you find not only thoughts, but perhaps poetry, things that elevate the spirit in the finds that you have.
Yeah, and I find it just illuminating of the world that the biblical characters lived in. It just tells us more about what was around them, and that tells us more about their societies. These letters are very, 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 very small, by the way. They're a millimeter wide to 3 millimeters wide, I think, is the largest one. So someone took great care to use a bronze needle and scratch these words into, or these words, a sentence into this tiny object.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously it had some importance to them. I kind of think maybe it was a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe someone was giving somebody who had lice in their beard a gift, and happy birthday, use this to keep the lice out of your beard, sort of thing. So
it's interesting that human habits and human thoughts are eternal. Okay, now the big drum roll to the most important find.
All righty.
Jerusalem Carbon 14 Survey 2024. What's all that about?
Wow. One of the things that is problematic with excavations in Jerusalem is getting some fixed dates. It was over excavated back in a time when excavations were done poorly for a whole host of reasons. So much has been disturbed and overturned. And also the site itself has just been occupied and reoccupied. And when the new occupiers come in, they tear everything down to bedrock because the dirt isn't very thick there anyway, deep there anyway, and they start rebuilding. So there's this jumble of stuff, for lack of a better term. However, over the last couple of years, there's been a survey going on that has been collecting datable material that can be used for carbon-14 dating from as best of controlled locations as they can. So, you find something, it's datable. Let's say you find an olive pit, or you find the remains of a burned basket, or you find a piece of rope, or whatever, anything that was living plant matter to begin with, and you find it in good context, and you find it in a controlled archaeological dig. So you know what this object was, you know where it was found, and you know roughly the time period it was found in because of things that were found with it. And then it took about 100 of these and did some very intensive carbon-14 dating on them. And sort of the overall result is that because of this structure, and some of them are very precise. There were 11 samples, for example, found in a series of floors in one building. So we had a large building, had been used and reused many, many times, and they found a series of 11 floors where people cleared it all down, put a new layer on, packed it down tight, etc., and then did whatever they did. And then later on, somebody came in, put a new floor in, packed it down tight. So you've got a very sharp stratigraphy there that does not have a lot of time between each of the uses, probably. Okay? And they were able to find datable material in each of those floors. So you've got this neat stack of these 11 objects or so. Send that all off to get it carbon-14 dated, and comes back with some very interesting finds. First of all, for many years, we've always thought that the city of David, sort of the southeastern ridge of the city of Jerusalem, was the core of the city of David, probably still is, and the rest of the area wasn't really inhabited until the time of Hezekiah, let's say. But these dates showed that the Western Hill was already occupied 100 years before Hezekiah. So all the way in the 800s BC, the Western Hill seemed to have been part of the city of Jerusalem. It showed some of these things were found in tombs that they uncovered. So you've got occupation and usage of burial sites, etc., that sort of expands our idea of how big the city of Jerusalem was and how early it became a big city. That many scholars believed it wasn't an important city until the 700s BC, again, about the time of Hezekiah, maybe not even until the time of Josiah. This sort of puts a check on that, because although you cannot be too specific because of how some of these finds were discovered, we do know that people were occupying these sites. And specifically, I'm sure you've been to Jerusalem. There's a place called the Broad Wall, or Hezekiah's Wall. Yeah. It's in what now is the old city of Jerusalem. It's about 15 feet wide, about 5 meters wide, huge defensive portion of a defensive wall. There's a gate tower not too far from it called the Israelite Tower. Traditionally, it has been understood that it was Hezekiah that built that wall, and that was based upon the dating of the buildings that had to be destroyed to put that wall into place, because it's sitting on top of some buildings, and dating they found datable material they found in the wall. Probably going to have to push that back about 70 years to the time of Uzziah, before the time of Hezekiah. So, I mean, all this is really interesting. None of it is super concrete, and saying, okay, now we know for sure that X is Y, but it certainly opens the door, and I would say more than it opens the door. It certainly opens the door and keeps it open for the idea that Jerusalem was a larger city earlier than many people would have given her credit to be, simply because we didn't have the data before.
Well, yeah, like even going before Abraham, it just seemed like there was absolutely nothing there. When he sacrificed Isaac, it was just an altar, and that was it. It was a desolate area, but who knows what it was even there at that time.
Right.
So
yeah, no, and we know it's been a city at various times in history. It's just been very, very hard to find out how big and speculate how many people, because, like I said, the site gets reused, it gets scraped down to the bare bedrock and then rebuilt. And so it's not like a typical site where you've got layers and layers of occupation.
Yeah, and the thing is, those who travel to Jerusalem, they think that that's what it was like in Christ's time. No, it's a couple layers above that, you know.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah.
People think I just touched the same thing Jesus did. Well, and guess what? Probably
Yeah.
not.
Got to be about 10 feet lower. Yes.
Anything else you'd like to comment on in this segment? We have really, really appreciated your giving us this overview. It's fascinating.
Well, yeah, I think just back to the carbon-14 survey again, just to be a bit more precise. Like I said, we always thought it was built, or many people thought that all this fortification was done in the time of Hezekiah. And we've got 2 Chronicles 32, verse 5, where it talks about Hezekiah building up the wall. He built up the wall that was broken down. He raised towers upon it. And outside it, he built another wall, and he strengthened the Millo and the city of David. And he also made weapons and shields in abundance. So we had that dating from the past, and we had a connection to scripture of Hezekiah. So it was easy to say, aha, this is probably Hezekiah. Well, now it turns out that that dating's probably too late. We need to push it all the way past towards the time there was an earthquake in 760 BC, which is written about in scripture as well. Mm-hmm. And we push it all the way that time period, but that doesn't push us out of the realm of the Bible, because we can look in 2 Chronicles 26, verse 9, and we can see that Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, the valley gate, and the corner buttresses, and he fortified them. So it's quite interesting to me that totally independent of scripture, this fortification has been moved from one time where fortification building was mentioned in scripture, mm-hmm. to another time where fortification building was already mentioned in scripture. Uh-huh. So I see that as confirmation of the accuracy, mm-hmm. of whether it was exactly these fortifications or not. Who cares? You know, this shows us that there are kernels of truth and accuracy in the historical writings that would not have been known several hundred years later.
Final words here before we.
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on. Thank you to the listeners who are listening to it. I hope they find it interesting. If anyone has a specific topic they'd like to hear something about, please send it to Vic, and he can send it on to me, and I will consider it. I won't promise to do everything that gets sent in. But yes, I love talking about this subject, and most importantly, I like making it approachable to average, everyday people. A lot of this stuff is written about in very dense language, and there is translation issues, you know, of going from scholarly language to normal human language, and we can lose some of the meaning. But I think it's valuable to do that, and I hope other people find it valuable. I love the subject, and I hope to continue working in it for a long time to come.
Well, you've made it very interesting to the average person who just thinks of archaeology as just going through a lot of rocks and having a hard time, you know, going through it all. But you've brought life to those rocks. The stones speak through things that you've said.
Thank you for that. Because all I can say is, once you go into archaeology, the rest of your life is going to be in ruins.
Okay, well, we'll just say goodbye to our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you for joining us today. Please share this podcast and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, and most other places where you get your podcasts. You can easily find us on any browser by simply typing in the Kubik Report. You can reach me by email at vic@kubik.org. vic@kubik.org. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us today. Please share this podcast and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, and most other places where you get your podcasts. You can easily find us on any browser by simply typing in The Kubik Report. You can reach me by email at vic@kubik.org. vic@kubik.org. Have a great day.